Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. I'm Pratik Raj. I'm a assistant professor of strategy at IIM Bangalore and also a junior fellow at the Stigler Center. This is an event jointly organized by IIM Bangalore's R&P division and the Stigler Center at Chicago booth. Before I start, I'll want to let you know that this event is being recorded, so I will request you to switch off your phones. Just a brief introduction. I don't think IMB needs any introduction. It's, you all are from IIM Bangalore. The Chicago booth Stigler Center is a center that studies regulatory capture and various other forms of distortions in capitalism. And it has various forms of outreach. For example, it has the Capitalism podcast. If in case you are, if you registered at the desk, you must have received a pamphlet on Capitalism podcast. It has a very nice blog called promarket.org, which again covers very deeply on issues of academic capture, regulatory capture, political capture, and other forms of market distortions. Obviously, Stigler Center does a lot of outreach, and this is a jointly organized event. Luigi Zingales is with us here today, and he is the director of the Stigler Center and one of the most highly cited economists with expertise in a wide range of topics on corporate governance, corporate finance, cultural economics. Increasingly, these days, he's with Oliver Hart. He's talking about the role of shareholder value versus shareholder wealth. He is also known in India as the co-author of Raghuram Rajan, and with him, he has written the book Saving Capitalism from the Capitalists, which I will highly recommend you to read. It's a very nice book talking about political economy and capitalism. Today, he is going to talk about Crony Capitalism, and I'll like to invite Luigi for the talk.
So first of all, thank you very much, Pratik, for the introduction. And thank you for inviting me here in Bangalore and in India. As I was at Nimrana a couple of days ago, and I said I feel very much at home in India because there are a lot of things in common between Indians and Italians. First of all, of course, a very long history that is lacking in the United States. Then it's a country that both countries are very sort of widespread. There's widespread corruption and tax evasion. And there's a country with infinite creativity in go-around rules, so difficult countries to run. And last but not least, and this is, I didn't add in that context, but I'm told it's okay to say, the country is run by mothers. It's just Italians and Indians are very attached to their mothers and do everything their mothers say to do. And I think that I don't know to what extent this widespread use of tax evasion and corruption is related to the fact that family is so much more important than anything else in those two countries, but that's remains to be seen. Second thing is I understand from Pratik that this is a very famous setting for a Bollywood success in which somebody makes fun of himself and becomes a fool in front of the audience, so I hope I'm not going to do that. Especially because I understand that the title of my presentation from Crony Capitalism has become compassionate capitalism, which I think, as you will understand at the end of the talk, is probably a Freudian lapsus in the mind of many, but hopefully I will be clear in my presentation. So what I want to discuss today is a very broad topic, which is why the capitalist system that came as a triumph or triumphant in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall is increasingly under threat around the world. And let me start with a survey of young Americans. If you look at the bottom there, the people between 18 and 34, which of the following, if any, do you identify as? And basically, as many of the millennia identify as socialists as capitalists. And this changes in later years, but the new generation in America does not really believe in capitalism. The fact not only is the support is similar, but it's also very low. So people don't recognize themselves into the system. Now, this is not unique to the United States. If you look at the trust in private enterprises, actually India is pretty much at the bottom of the distribution. There is sort of a very deep distrust toward the private sector. And in Nimrana the other day, some of the commentators say, whenever you do economic policy in India, you have to understand that capitalism is seen per se as evil, and then you have to sort of adapt your policy to that perception. And that's, at some level, is surprising, because if you look around the world, this seems, in many, many ways, the best of times. And there's a very famous psychologist, Pinker, who says that this is the best possible time. And in many dimensions, it is. First of all, if you look at the growth in GDP per capita, in the last century, but in the particular last 30 years, have been remarkable, not just in the advanced nations, but everywhere in the world. And basically, with a couple of exceptions in Africa, every country is much better off today than it was 30 years ago. More importantly, the number of people in poverty, and of course there is a bit of arbitrariness in measuring this, but the absolute number of people in poverty, forget the percentage, but the absolute number of people in poverty has shrunk dramatically in the last 30 years. And much of that success is due to China, but India also participates in that as an important step. And the World Bank celebrated a couple of months ago the fact that the turning point came that the majority of the world is middle class. Now, again, how to define middle class is somebody that is able to basically buy the basic appliances and not being at risk of starvation in case he or she loses her job. So I think that the fact that the majority of the world now is middle class is an enormous success. And this reflects in other indicators, not just money, but other indicators. Look at how much the life expectancy has increased or in the world, but more importantly, how that distribution has shrunk. Okay, so if you look back in 1950, there was one part of the world that had a pretty decent life expectancy, and by today, everybody is improving, so much so that actually you're better off in terms of life expectancy to be born in India today than in Italy in the 1950s. And basically is almost as good as to be born in India today than in any of the most developed nations in 1950. So if you look at all this together, you say sort of why people are upset. And this is not true in general, it's also true in India. India did experience an enormous increase in per capita income in the last 30 years. The only reason why you don't feel as much is because you always compare to China, they go even faster. But by every measure, this is a remarkable success. And I kept insisting with my friends, it's a remarkable success, particularly because it was obtained in a democracy. We know that dictatorships are faster in moving along, but there are some important costs, and India has not paid those costs. So in that sense, is a fantastic success. So why there is so much resentment against capitalism? And the answer is, if we look closer, it says all the successes I described are indeed true. So I'm not want to reduce those, but if we look closer, especially in developing nations, and then of course I will also developed nation, I will move later to India, but if you look at the United States, for example, there is this very stunning picture. This is the real wage of males and females white workers. Now, why do I focus particularly on white? Because the black population is catching up. So we're looking at, for example, a white male, and the real median wage has not increased in the last 40 years. So let's pause a second to take this in. Means that the majority, 50%, of the US workers did not see a real increase in wages in the last 40 years. This is difficult in every country, but it's particularly difficult in a country that is built on the idea of the land of opportunity, the frontier, I'm sort of always getting better, the American dream. All these things does not seem to hold for a large fraction of the population. And now, this number has been disputed in many, many ways. Number one, this is a wage number. If you look at income, household income has gone up. The median household income has gone up. Why? For two reasons. Female work participation has increased, and two, of course, female wages have caught up. Why? Because they were starting from such a low level and discriminated level. That discrimination has not disappeared, but has shrunk, and so that led to an improvement. Second, some of these measures of wages do not include some of the benefits that workers get. The benefit is health insurance, and health insurance did improve certainly in value. However, the US health insurance is probably one of the most inefficient in the world, so it's not clear that you get dollar for dollar what you pay for, number one. Number two, life expectancy in the United States is not particularly large in spite of the money spent in health insurance. So by and large, I think this picture is probably a realistic picture. And at the same time, what we have seen in the last 2 decades has been a dramatic drop in the share of output that goes to labor. So that's very much in the spirit. We see wages not rising, in capital, if you want, getting the largest share. We've seen another phenomenon which is pretty stunning, which is the end of convergence. One of the positive messages of the more traditional growth theory was that eventually we're all going to go to the same place. And so one of the implications was that countries or cities that started with a higher per capita income will grow less. And so eventually you reach the same steady state. And what is interesting, if you look in this picture, so this is the US in the 1940, 1980, this was remarkably true, was one of the few successes of economic theory. When you bring the theory to the data, they don't behave as well as this one, because this is like basically a straight line. Is not even if you make up the data, you can get such a nice feat. Now look at the period 1980-2010. That slope has disappeared. So cities that were richer to begin with grow as fast as cities that were poor to begin with. And so that's the end of convergence, is creating basically a dichotomic world, a world of rich cities on the one hand and a world of poor countryside on the other hand. Speaking of American dream, one of the remarkable results that Chetty showed using very detailed data in the United States is that the probability of making it more than your father did is shrinking incredibly fast. So let me explain this very simple graph. This is the cohort you have been born, and this is the chance that in your lifetime you're going to make more than your father did in his lifetime. Okay? And basically what this is saying, if you're born in 1940, unless you were the son of Rockefeller, you were probably making more than your father. Okay? So 90% of the people were making it. Now, you go down and you see this number is going down. Now, for those not born in 1980s, that is born afterward, but if the millennia are probably facing less than even chances of making more in their lifetime than their parents. And in a country built on the sort of myth of the American dream and the country of opportunities, that's extremely depressing. In fact, the depression is added by the fact that if you look at the employment rate, we always hear about the fact that unemployment is very low in the United States, and that's great. However, as you well know, unemployment is only measured of people who actively seek an employment. And a larger fraction of prime age males are out of the workforce and not willing to come in. So this is the fraction of people between males between 25 and 54. Remember, in 1965, 95% of those people were employed. So short of being on disability or having major diseases, I think that that cohort was employed. Now you see every recession, the shaded areas are recession. During every recession, this number goes down, and then it comes back up a bit, but not at the previous level. So overall, you have a pretty clear trend, and by now, even at the top of the expansion, only 85% of the males in America are working. Now, we wish these were all people that took up the role of taking care of the kids and letting their wives work. We doubt that 10% of Americans actually are doing that. The most likely scenario is that these are people that have given up the hope of finding a job. And the flip side of that is one of the most chilling flip side of that is, for the first time in basically American history, the life expectancy of white males has gone down, not up. This is the flip side. This is the mortality rate. You see every country is going down, and then US white is going, mortality is going up, and this is very much a result of the opioid crisis that is really devastating the country. Every year, 50, 60,000 people die of overdose of opioid. Just to give you the sense, this is more than the peak of AIDS victim at the worst moment of AIDS. This is more than the entire Vietnam War. So, and this takes place every year. So this is a dramatic number. And so you're not surprised to see that an increasing number of people feel unsatisfied with the system and actually depressed about their future. And here you see in the United States, only 33% of people think that their children will be better off. Now, the good news is this is much higher than what is in Italy, that is only 19%. So Italians are deeply depressed. In this, we are very different from Indian. 66% of Indians think there is a brighter future, and it's not surprising given the growth rate. But still, the fact that only a third of Americans has a future that their kids are going to do better than themselves is a pretty sad state of affairs. Now, as I said, of course, in India, the future looks very much brighter. However, India is bringing with itself a legacy of a dramatic past. And capitalism very often is linked to the tragic act of the East India Company. As you know, Adam Smith, the founder of economics, actually wrote extensively about the corruption of the East India Company in The Wealth of Nations. So I think at the very foundation of capitalism, there was the repulsion toward a form of really monopolistic capitalism and very criminal capitalism. Now, as you all know, it's not only about the past, it's also about the present of, and the image that the capitalists in India represent. So the question is, if so many people hate capitalism for maybe the good reason, which capitalists we care, we want, and what are the distortions, and what can we do to fix them? So let's first clear out certain statement, because we always talk about free markets, but when we say about free markets, what do we mean with a free market system that very often capitalists identify as a free market system? I think the idea is that resources are allocated across units on basis of voluntary exchanges and not through the power of fiat, which is the power of the government. In a central economy, decisions are made based on political authority. Here, they are based on voluntary exchange. And we economists believe that markets are superior in this allocation. And why we think that that's the case? I think we think that is the case because an allocation requires eliciting two types of information that are difficult to elicit. One is, what are the preferences, the individual preferences? And two, what are the availability either of goods or the cost of producing goods at the local level? All this information is hard to aggregate and process even in today's world of computer, let alone in the past. And the key intuition that was Adam Smith's intuition, and then it took basically 150 years for economists to prove it formally, but the key intuition is that prices are extremely good at eliciting this information in a way that is truthful, that is, as we economists say, incentive compatible. And not only this, but that the coordination of economic activity based on prices is actually possible and has some nice property that we call is somewhat efficient. And this is, for those of you who are economists formally trained, this is the first welfare theorem. Now, as I would say in a second, the first welfare theorem, as all theorems, come with assumptions, and we need to discuss those. But I think that the reason why we think that markets work is precisely because this intuition of Adam Smith has been formalized. Now, there is also another feature that we like of prices, is that prices represent the social value of a good. So even governments use prices in accounting, for example, in cost-benefit analysis, because prices have this nice feature that they represent the social value or the social cost of a good. Now, however, for a market system to work, we need to have two conditions. One is that everybody acts as a price taker, and this is the way the welfare theorem has been formulated. And what I want to add, because it's kind of implicit, but it's very important, is also everybody act as a rule taker. So everybody takes the stuff as exogenous. So what does it mean? That there is no power to affect prices, and there is no power to change, no power of every single actor in this economy to unilaterally change the rules. Now, as you know, if you take it to the extreme, these assumptions are not true anywhere in the world. And the question is, to what extent these deviations are reasonable, to what extent are so large that the very essence of the system does not hold. And so let me go through some examples of cases in the United States mostly, because I don't know so much about India, but I'm sure there are plenty of examples in India too, where the lack of price-taking behavior is actually important, reaches the level of not just a second-order nuisance, but of a first-order sort of violation. The first one is the energy deregulation in California. Energy was controlled everywhere in the United States. At some point in California, they decided to liberalize the price, and they said, okay, let's use market to allocate energy. And in particular, let's run continuous auction on prices on an exchange. And when they started this deregulation, they looked at the producer of energy, and they made the mistake of saying the production is fairly fragmented. So this is a market where nobody has undue influence. So this market will have the characteristic that we like of markets to allocate prices and units efficiently. And then they realized that, wait a minute, energy is not storable, and what really matters is the producer of the last unit of energy at the peak time. And in those producers tend to be one or two. They tend to have an enormous market power, and they are able to manipulate the market massively. So the energy deregulation in California was a gigantic fiasco because they didn't anticipate the market power of some few producers. In other parts of the country where the deregulation was designed in a better way, the same problem did not arise. Which speaks is when we think about free market, we shouldn't make the mistake of saying free markets equal markets without rules. Because markets only work under some rules, and then the question is, are those rules designed to make the market work in an idealistic fashion, like Adam Smith has envisioned, or are they there just to sort of protect the stronger party in a relationship? So another case is the pharmaceutical industry in the United States. You probably, unless you watch a lot of American TV, you don't know who this guy is. This guy has the fame of being the most hated man in America. Okay? How do you reach that privilege at a young age? So this guy was a hedge fund manager, and what he did, he bought out a drug, Deraprime, and what it did is increase the price of Deraprime by a factor of 56. Okay, so the price was $13.5 a pill, and he raised it to $750 a pill. Why? Because number one, was the only producer of that drug. Number two, who is the buyer of that drug? Mostly US Medicare. And they cannot, by rules, by design, the US government has prevented Medicare to bargain on the price of drugs. As a result, they are price taker, and the producer are price maker. And they can make any money they want. Now, why this guy is so hated? Because he did with gusto what the pharmaceutical industry does regularly. Okay? He went a bit overboard, so he multiplied by a factor of 56. The pharmaceutical industry does a factor of 2 or 3 per year, but they do it slowly. And most importantly, when they go in front of Congress, they don't have that face that looks like you really want to punch him. They have like a contrite face of people who feel sorry. And that's the reason why they get away. But the pharmaceutical industry in the United States is taking advantage of the system in a massive way. And in fact, in a country that claims that is in favor of free trade, at least before Trump, is the only sector where there is no free trade. Because drugs in Canada, drugs produced in the United States, they cost less in Canada, but there is a prohibition of reimportation. Why? Because the system allows the pharmaceutical industry to do price discrimination and extract every possible dollar of surplus from Medicare at the expenses of the public at large. Another example of influence is actually telecom in Mexico. I don't know if you know who the guy is Carlos Slim. He used to be the richest man in the world, and recently lost $30 million. Now, don't feel sorry because he had $30 million left, so he's still pretty rich, but he lost his ranking in Forbes. Why? Because his fortune was based on a really strong monopoly power in Mexico. He controlled 80% of the fixed line operator and 70% of the mobile in Mexico. And so if you own 80% of one and 70% of the other, you set the price you want, and it's easy to make money. And finally, the Mexican parliament introduced some legislation, and that legislation actually led to a 47% reduction in basically cost for users, a 59% increase in mobile traffic, and a $32 billion in loss in the wealth of Carlos Slim. So what I want to say is that being price maker has devastating effect for the public at large, is very beneficial for a few. And when you think about the income inequality, think about monopoly as playing an important role in that. Staying with the telecom industry, what about rule takers? So in a work I've done with Mara Faccio, we look at some rules that tend to make the market more competitive. And these rules are number portability, the fact that you can switch operator from one to the other. Now, this number portability in most countries has been introduced by regulation. It's not, companies were not willing to do it unless the state imposed that. The possibility of sharing the mobile infrastructure or the voice over the internet protocol. All these things, we saw that when they are present, this leads to less concentration in the mobile industry, lower prices, but also no less investment and no sort of less quality. So those rules seems to be good for everybody except the owner of the mobile industry. So the question is, if this is the case, why not every country in the world adopt those rules? And the answer is, it depends mostly on two factors. Number one, how politically connected is the, or are the major telecom operator with the political system. So if there is a lot of overlap between the political system and the mobile operator, it's less likely that those rules are in place. If you are a democratic country, and we use polity 4 as a measure of democracy, if you are a democratic country, is more likely to have those rules in place. In fact, I think that India is a democratic country and fares well on those metrics, and is one of the countries with the lowest prices in mobile communication. So I think that this equates. Another example, this is actually a paper that is on the job market this year from a woman at Harvard. And what she does, which I find it extremely interesting, she looks at the externality of lobbying. So what she does is she looks at the announcement effect of lobbying based on how similar the products are. So if I am in the decile 10 of product similarity, so my product is very similar to the product of a firm lobbying, when that law is passed, my stock price goes up. If I start to be a bit different, then what I see is that the stock price actually goes down. So what this is saying is that lobbying actually has a negative effect on my competitors. Lobbying is creating legislation that represent a barrier to entry to the system. And last but not least, in terms of non-rule takers, enforcement is very arbitrary. You know, after the great financial crisis of 2008, only 2 bankers went to jail. And one of the 2 is this family of bankers from New York that ran a little community bank in New York, and they were very aggressively prosecuted for something that turned out to be wrong. On the other hand, you have Robert Rubin, who has been deferred from prosecution by the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission on 2 charges to the Attorney General. The Attorney General dropped the case. Why? My claim is friends in high places. So depending on who you know, the enforcement against what you do changes dramatically. And you always thought that this maybe is a characteristic of Italy or India. No, the consolation is, even in the United States, this takes place all the time. But increasingly so today, rather than in the past. So what is the lesson here is, for capitalists to work, we need 2 things. We need competition, and we need impartiality in rules. If we don't have one of the 2, capitalism does not work. And of course, when capitalism does not work, then it generates all the negative effects that we have described. So let me show one example, because you say, you're being a little bit fast here. You're saying that if you don't have competition, if you don't have rule taking, why you have the consequences that you described at the beginning of as the negative aspect of capitalism. Now, I have an entire course documenting that, so let me show you at least one example of this. We discuss about the decline in the labor share of output. Okay? Now, remember this picture? This is the labor share of output that's been declining the last 20 years. What I want to argue, and actually a former student of mine formally argued that, is that this decline in output is in fact driven by increase in monopolization or decrease in competition. And this is not an obvious conclusion, because most people look at this and say, oh, this has been fault of the demise of the unions, or capitalists too aggressive, or so on and so forth. But my students did a very simple calculation. Said, look, wait a minute. What is the labor share of output? Is the product of wages times people working divided by value added. Okay, that's output. Now, most people say that if the labor share goes down, it must be that the capital share goes up. However, this is literally true, so this equality is literally true, only if the economy is in perfect competition. Because if value added is the sum of labor share and capital share, the return to entrepreneurship, the so-called profits, are equal to zero. Now, in a non-competitive market, the value added is bigger. Why? Because you have a term called profit. Now, if you have a term called profit, in order to figure out what happens, you have to separate what we call the capital share of output from the profits. Now, how do you determine the capital share of output? There is a calculation that I don't want to spend too much time, but you have an expected return of capital times the existing amount of capital, and what you show is that actually the capital share as return to capital is going down, and of course, if both these components going down, by residual, the profit shares is going up. Now, you say, okay, that's not a big deal, because at the end of the day, most of the time, the owner of stock are the one that gets both the return to capital and the profits. So is this just a relabeling? And the answer is not, for two reasons. Number one, if you keep the markups, which is a measure of market power, if you keep the markup fixed, then any change in relative prices or in technology that causes a decline in the labor share must cause an increase in the capital share. Okay? Why? Because capital and labor are substitute. So if you change the price of one, and technology changes the price of one, it must be that the other changes. So why this is important is because once we document that both capital and labor share go down, then the only source of that must be an increase in profits, must be an increase in markup, and not surprisingly, in a cross-section, actually documents that the two are correlated, that when you see an increase in concentration, you also see a decline in the labor share. Now, correlation is not causality, but with all these things put together, is a pretty strong suggestion that the two things are related. And this is important because think about from a policy point of view, if the return to capital was indeed so high, then people will invest massively. And then you look in the United States, people are sitting on a large amount of profits and not investing. How is it possible that you are making a lot of profits and not investing? The only possibility is because the profits don't come from return to capital, come from some monopoly profits. So if you are Coke, and if you invest more in plant and equipment, you're going to simply produce more Cokes and the price will go down. You're not maximizing profits. Why? Because most of your profits come from the secret formula, and short of producing another secret formula, all your investments are not profitable, so you don't invest and actually keep the prices up. And of course, if prices are up, labor share and capital shares are down, and that increase to, or that contributes to the sense of not improvement in the standard of living that most Americans feel. Now, given this example, I hope you grant me the fact that in order for a capitalist system to work properly, we need to have a competition and we have impartiality in rules. Now, maintaining this is actually much, much harder than people make it to be. And in particular, what I want to argue is that there is a vicious circle between having market power and having violation of the impartiality rule. Why? Because, number one, if you have a lot of market power, you know the old saying, who has the gold makes the rules, and market power gives you the gold to buy the rules. But also, if you have an enormous amount of market power, you need to protect that market power against some form of, you can call it political expropriation, or you can call it regulation, depending on your viewpoint, but is from being attacked by the political system. Why? Because if you are competitive, nobody can attack you through legislation. But if you are enjoying a large amount of rent, even the government can expropriate and enjoy part of that rent. So as a monopolist, you feel the need of actually controlling the government. It's a bit like the oil industry in many countries. If you are in Iraq, or if you are in Mexico, either the state owns the oil industry or the oil industry owns the state. There is nothing in between, okay? And that's exactly where market power leads to political power. But it's also the other way around. Of course, if you are able to modify the rules, does that ability transform naturally into a barrier to entry and is the best form to transform your political power into money. And I call it the Medici vicious circle because the Medici family in Florence in the Renaissance made its money through a competitive banking sector, okay? But unlike the Peruzzi and Bardi that stay in that sector and lost everything, they transform their market power into a political power by basically buying out the electoral system and having one of the Medici in power in Florence for the better part of 2 centuries. And by being in power, they granted themselves a bunch of mining rights and special license that gave them money for the 2 centuries to come. So the only way in which market power becomes permanent is when it's embedded in political powers and is a vicious circle that we see playing all the time everywhere. So what is crony capitalism? Crony capitalism is a market economy or alleged market economies where the rules and their enforcement are not impartial because they are affected by family connection, political connection, clan connection, open bribes. So you choose your poison. Those poisons might be different in different parts, but the essence is the same. It's a degeneration of the competitive free market system to the benefits of the few. So how can we guarantee the impartiality of the rules? Now, in a standard economic assumption, when we write down our models, we tend to assume one of the following. One is that maybe there is a benevolent social planner that designed the rules in an impartial way. Now, unfortunately, these are in short supply these days, and it's very hard to find one. The second is that the rules are naturally the result of a selection process that leads to the survival of the fittest. Now, this is bad biology imported by economics that don't even understand sort of the natural selection process, because the people who know the natural selection process knows that it's not necessarily the survival of the fittest. It's actually the survival of the most prolific one. That is not necessarily the fittest. And there are a lot of examples of deviation from that. And the same is true in legal rules. It's not necessarily that the best rules prevail. It's the rules that are beneficial to the strongest parties that survive in long term. And if you have any doubt, I have some colleagues at Chicago that actually challenge this view. And whenever they challenge this view, I said, look, female circumcision is still a practice in a large part of the world, and tell me what efficiency rules are associated with that. The third thing is people often assume that rules are the result of a grand bargaining in which everybody is perfectly informed, everybody is sitting at the table, and everybody vote in the same way. Now, we know that none of this is true. So the least best alternative that we have figured out is called democracy. But democracy is at risk of two degeneration. One is a degeneration into what some people call populism, maybe is better defined as left-wing populism, that says that a desire to redistribute to the poor. And now, this desire sometimes is so strong that is even breaking some of the incentives that make the system work. So one example, and I will come back and discuss that again, but one example is some form of minimum wage. On the one hand, is a form of redistribution, so we like the fact that the poor people get better treatment. However, if this is pushed too much, the consequence is that a lot of people will not find a job, and so is kind of a well-intended action that is self-defeating. And many of the Latin American populists, think about Chavez, for example, are well-intended action with disastrous consequences. And that's one potential deviation of a democracy. The other one is in the opposite direction, which is a democracy that degenerates into a plutocracy, in which the rules are designed to redistribute actually from the poor to the rich. So let me give you an example of this. Everybody knows Chile as an example of application of Chicago principles. However, in applying the Chicago principle to Chile, they forgot some important ones, and one is antitrust, and the second is sort of fairness of rules. So I was discussing with some MBA students from Chile, the Chilean economy, and discussing whether the Chilean economy was an example of crony capitalism. And they said, no, we are very efficient. Look, highways are privatized and they're very efficiently done. This is schools are privatized, very efficiently run. And I said, okay, what about fisheries? You know, if you know the geography of Chile, there's a lot of fishery in Chile. It's worth a fortune. Just by accident, is given for free to one family whose claim to fame is they supported the Christian Democrats against Pinochet at the end of his regime. Now, very good thing to do to fight Pinochet, but not a reason to reward something to a value of billions of dollars, because the value of the fisheries was billions of dollars. And since this family, that by the way is of Italian origin, Angelini, that owns all the fisheries, have been able to fight back some form of auction system for the last 30 years. And every new government comes in and said, we're going to reform the fishery, blah, blah, and surprise, surprise, they don't get it through. Now, the other thing is that when I was in Chile a few years ago, Bachelet was still prime minister or president, and her son was discovered having taken a bribe from nothing short than the former son-in-law of Pinochet. Why? Because the former son-in-law of Pinochet owned the largest nickel mine that, by the way, was privatized during the Pinochet regime. So if it sounds familiar, it's because it is familiar. And even Chile, that would like to be the Switzerland of Latin America, in fact, has a pretty crony capitalist side when it comes to rule. So this is really money that is redistributed from the poor to the rich with a large consensus that is mostly bought out in many ways. And the reason why I said at the beginning that maybe the word crony capitalism, the translation of crony capitalism into compassionate capitalism was a Freudian lapsus, is because there is a surprise link between populists and plutocrats. Many see them at the opposite end of the spectrum, but in fact is a bit like the alliance between the Baptists and the bootleggers. I don't know if you know this part of American history, but during the Prohibition era, there were the Baptists who were in favor of prohibitionists for ideological reasons, and there were the bootleggers that were the ones producing their illegal alcohol and selling it at inflated prices. They were in favor of the prohibitionists for business reasons. And they had this strange alliance between the two. And by the way, is still today the only reason why finally the alliance between the extreme right and the pharmaceutical industry blocking the legalization of marijuana across the United States is being defeated is thanks to local referenda. Because in the United States, the pharmaceutical industry was able to legalize opium because Oxycontin is nothing short than opium, but with a license to make money for one pharmaceutical industry, but marijuana was not legalized, and if it wasn't for the referendum institution, would still be illegal in most states in the United States. But so how does it go, this very dangerous vicious circle between the crony capitalism and the compassionate capitalist? So you start in a system in which maybe is distorted like today, and so you have a well-intention to distort the rule of law in favor of the poor. So you expropriate maybe landowners, or you redistribute wealth in one form or another. And this, of course, generates uncertainty. And when there is uncertainty, entrepreneurs trying to hedge this uncertainty by what? By buying political favor. If they know there is a risk they might be expropriated, and I use the word expropriation in a broad sense because some regulation tantamount to expropriation. So if they are in fear of expropriation in some ways, they start to protect themselves by lobbying. So, and initially they start lobbying to get the government off their back, but then they, learning by doing, they transform their lobbying in a way to get the government in their pocket. And so from sort of fighting to prevent expropriation, they actually fight to distort the rules of the game in their favor. And the more the rules of the game are distorted in their favor, the more the populists have a legitimate reason to complain. And the more they have legitimate reason to complain, the more they're going to start to feed in and trying to undo the system in order to favor the poor. So I was telling you earlier about the minimum wage. The minimum wage in a fully competitive economy is distortionary. But if the economy is not that fully competitive, and if labor is particularly weak, minimum wages might actually both increase wages and increase employment. Why? Because wages are kept too low by a few employers that collude. And even in the United States, we have increasing evidence that employers collude to keep the wages low. I don't know if you follow, but a few years back, in the very Silicon Valley, they discovered that Apple, Google, and all the major ICT companies were colluding to keep the wages of the engineers low. And Discovery showed emails between Eric Schmidt and Steve Jobs, who was still alive at the time, where they were sort of saying, oh, I'm sorry that I poached your guy, I will never do that again. If you try, I'm going to retaliate, and so on and so forth. So they reached a nice agreement to not increase wages, not to poach to each other, basically collude, and that is highly illegal. So the problem is, the more the system deviates from the ideal setting, the more distortionary action are actually beneficial, and they justify intervention. And of course, the more the other side feels the need to be protected, and so this vicious circle starts to spin faster and faster. So that's the reason why I think, in my view, it's so important to think about how to break this circle early on. And in many cases, the system is not through expropriation, but through making the market more competitive and more fair for everyone. And with these words, I sort of finish with a little bit of infomercial. If you want to sort of hear more of this discussion, I now have a podcast with Kate Waldock from Georgetown, where we discuss every other week some of the current issues of capitalism. And the title is Capitalism because it represents what is working in capitalism and what isn't. Thank you. Is there time for a few questions?
Yeah, sure. Any questions? Any other questions?
So one of the issues, yeah,
Where are you?
Down here, right down
Okay.
here.
So close that I couldn't see you.
So one of the issues, when competition, the increasing competition, lack of competition these days in companies like Google and Apple and all this, is how would a regulator stop that? Because they're offering their products for free, right? How do you judge that? Okay, there's no competition here if everybody's using Gmail, but it costs them nothing. How do you prove that welfare is actually being destroyed?
Thank you for this question. If I had paid you for this question, would not have been asked better, because I think it's a really important and fundamental question for a number of reasons. One is that, as you said, there are clearly large efficiency gains, for example, of Google to be the search engine of everybody because they become more efficient, etc. And this naturally leads to some form of market power. I think that this is not just a problem of Google. I think this is a problem more general of the digital economy, where there are the capital is intangible. There are great economies of scale, in particular, when it comes to digital platforms, where on top of the standard thing of the digital economy, we have the two-sided nature of markets. And I think that we need to rethink seriously, basically, most of our results in economics in light of this new challenge. So much so that as Stigler Center, we are actually preparing a conference this coming May on this issue, trying to tackle the problem of digital platform from 4 points of view, because that's what makes the problem very severe. Is there is a standard economic argument, but there is, for example, a media argument. So I am not afraid that my newspaper edits stuff according to left or right leanings, because there is competition among newspapers. And I think that at the end, competition will lead to a fairly unbiased outcome. We cannot rely on that on Google. So the news is a big issue. Of course, there is a big privacy issue, and there is an enormous political economy issue. We know that small changes in the ranking of Google might determine people voting for one candidate or the next. And now, it might be true that Google or Facebook are a bit too afraid to do that in the United States because Congress and the media will come after, but they impact all the world. So what is the guarantee that if I want a new license in India, I don't trade some more favorable ranking for the current government in exchange for this, or in Sri Lanka, or whatever country you name it. So I think that these problems are enormous and need to be tackled. And last year we had an initial conference on digital platform, at the end of which I came out with a conviction that a problem exists, and I'm not so sure how it should be tackled and in what ways because of this So the goal has been to break down the problem in 4 subcommittees that are doing their work now, and the 15th and 16th of May will be reported. And I invite you all, at least virtually, to that, because that would be sort of streamed. Maybe the time zone is not perfect, but it also would be taped in case you want to watch later, like every other initiative of the Stigler Center is, so you can access them online, as the past conferences, so if you have an interest. Because I think that, so that's a long way to say I don't have the answer yet, but I'm working on that.
Yeah, hey Luigi. This is a question across countries where, if you look at the model of China, so one of the things that you're talking about in terms of competition, so the Chinese model is getting into certain countries, offer them very similar to free products or free service or free military aid, and then corner the market, and then eventually the dependencies are very high, and so you control, it's almost like a monopoly at the government level. So given what Trump is trying to do you think that's the way to approach a monopoly by, whatever the technique that he's using, or is it something else that you think would be a better strategy? Given at the country level, the risk could be a war, or it could be much bigger than what Google or Amazon is doing.
But, let's face it, the United States were doing the same in a more subtle way in the past, okay? So I think that the entry of China is creating some competition in the international arena that, in a sense, is good. I think that actually, ironically, the Cold War was extremely useful to keep capitalism in check in the West. Why? Because people were afraid of the communist threat. And so there was more moderation throughout the world, and with the end of the Cold War, that moderation disappeared. We had excesses, and I think we need to go back to the Goldilocks. Now, maybe China would be an instrument of that. I'm not guaranteed, but I don't think it's necessarily bad if there is competition in that sector too.
Professor, hi.
Okay.
My question is, given automation coming in and the threat of a lot of middle class jobs that have been secured till date, what do you feel is going to be a sort of economic structure, given the trend of automation that's following up? Companies will have even more power now in their hands to control wages and labor, and also this concept of universal basic income that has come in. What is your opinion on the effectiveness of that?
A couple of easy questions, right? So number one, I will distinguish for automation into 2 problems. One is the long-term problem, the other the transition. I think on the long-term problem, I'm much more optimistic that we're going to figure out what other people will do in the future. And in most of the job, maybe not most, but a large fraction of the job that are around today were inconceivable 20 years ago. So, and many of the jobs were prevalent 20 years ago, they have disappeared from the face of Earth. So this has been going on since the Industrial Revolution and is a healthy process, and we should not stop it. However, I think that what has become more of an issue is the speed of adjustment of this. And to what extent I am a truck driver in my mid-50s. I'm not going to become a web designer after 2 years. Even if they trying to train me, I'm too old to be trained. You cannot teach an old dog a new trick. And so we need to find a way to transition these people in a way that is both economically and socially respectful. Because it's not only the problem of income. So I think the universal basic income, if it's like the last resort to take you away from starvation, is an excellent idea. But people want more than just income. They want a dignity. And in the United States, the people that lost a manufacturing job in the Midwest, they're not happy to live on dole, because their set of values are that they need to gain a gainful employment, and that brings dignity, brings also a social experience, brings a lot of things. So we need to rethink that in a massive way. So if universal basic income is just an handout, I don't think it's going to work. If that is, think about how to help people find a useful employment, because people want to also be useful for society, and certainly there are plenty of things we need help for. Starting with the environment. So I don't think that there is a lack of jobs. There is a mismatch between what we're willing to pay in this moment and what people are willing to do. So I think that the market system can help us, but also the state has a role in this transition. And I have been saying, and actually even in my book with Raghu, is even if you don't want to do it for if you want compassionate reason or social reason, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, but even if you're not down that path, I think having a safety net is crucial to make possible the transition of capitalism, the change of capitalism, because if you don't have a safety net, I think that the resentment against the system in a downturn would be so large that will bring down the system. So I think that having a safety net is an essential component of a well-working capitalist system, because one point that very often people miss is in a good capitalist system, the inefficient firms should be closed. But there is nothing that says that the workers in an inefficient firm should be heavily penalized. Okay? Because if the firm is mismanaged, it's not their fault, it's the manager's fault. They should lose money. We should help as much as possible the employees. Very often, at least in my country of origin, Italy, is the other way around, is you use workers to protect firms as a human shield against the inefficiency of the managers. And I think that's the worst possible system.
Sir?
Yeah.
Thank you, sir, for that session. From the session that you just gave, my basic understanding is due to the changes in the rules of the game, that is one of the major reasons for the crony capitalism to happen. So, but the point is, what role has the educational institutions like Booth or say even IMB has played in actually doing this? Because the rules of the games are written by people who have come from these educational institutions, right? So, or is it a systemic problem, or is it like, can we actually change it, or your thoughts on that?
So I think that you're raising a very important point, which is the responsibility that academia has in this system. And I actually wrote a paper that made me not particularly liked by my colleague, that is called Preventive Economist Capture. And what I did was a very simple exercise. I took basically the ideas behind Stigler regulatory capture and say, look, as economists, we think that regulators are captured not because they're bad people or dishonest people, but because of incentives. And incentives are career incentives, the issue about information, and possibly the fear of reputation if you go against the vested interest. And I'm saying that by and large, the same incentives apply to economists, academic economists, but to be honest, not just economists, academic anything, academic computer scientists, academic chemical engineers, and so on and so forth, or God forbid, doctors, okay, or pharmaceutical researchers. So I think that the structure of academia is designed to protect us, and good universities do that. And so the only difference is that if you are a regulator and you really go against sort of the powerful players, you get fired. As an academic, you don't. So I think we have a moral responsibility of take advantage of that unique position. In my view, is the only justification for tenure, because otherwise tenure is an old institution that does not have any reason to exist. If it does exist, is to protect the academic freedom. And so once I realized that, I decided I should really use the privilege in an effective way. And so even the talk I'm giving today is part of that sort of paying back to society for my tenure.
Sir, on your extreme right, I have a question. If I understand correctly, you said that if there is a lack of competition, for example, in the market, you can introduce distortions such as measures like minimum wage. But isn't this kind of measures will create more of such distortion, which is creating that vicious cycle, you know?
Absolutely, yeah.
And if you go back to such measures, in the long run, it would be difficult to revert back to that efficiency, which is the first objective to achieve in the first place. So isn't it misaligned, the measure to introduce such distortion? Rather, you would want it to keep, make it to tend towards more efficiency rather than introducing such measures.
This is, again, a distinction between long-term and short-term. In a sense, I completely agree that the risk in the long term is the vicious circle. But politicians don't survive the long term if they don't get re-elected in the short term. So the temptation to deviate is very important and very relevant. What is also important to keep in mind is the risk that this brings. So if you can address a system by increasing competition rather than some form of protection, is better. However, if you start from a situation of enormous imbalance, I think that the minimum wage can be beneficial, at least in the short term. The problem is, as all this temporary thing, is how do you make sure that this does not continue forever? I was discussing with one of your colleagues here that the nascent industry argument is very convincing, except that industries never graduate from being established, and so those subsidies never disappear. So that there is that risk in the long term.
So last question maybe I can ask. So
okay, please.
Given that your student, Krishnamurthy Subramaniam, is the new Chief Economic Advisor of India, what advice will you give to him as he advises the government?
So that's for the toughest question. Actually, I hope that he takes all these lessons into serious consideration. I think there is a lot that can be done in the financial sectors in India. I think that my co-author Raghu experienced at his own cost the resistance in the system. And I think that hopefully Subbu will push in the right direction. I think that this is a very long and difficult process. If you get used to have credit easily and undeservedly, and you could get away with not repaying it, is very painful to actually be forced to repay it. And you're going to fight in every possible political way. I don't know if this is ever possible until we have a better form of campaign financing, because I don't think, and I know I probably shouldn't enter into local politics, but my view is I don't think it's an issue of this party or that party. Is a system that receive a massive amount of contribution from few key players is inevitably captured by those few key players. And I think that this is a very serious problem. And at lunch we're computing what is the cost of politics in India adjusted to GDP, and is many, many times the one in the United States. In the United States, we think that politics is very expensive, but it seems that here is even more expensive. So something needs to be done. And until something is done on that front, I think it's going to be difficult to change other mechanisms.